Okay, so thank you for coming. This is a Friday before the holiday of, I'm talking about the Tuesday holiday. So thank you so much for coming despite your busy schedule. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Mariko Tamanoi. I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology at UCLA. I have been teaching since 1993. So I'm really very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Professor Daqing. I call him in that order, who is an associate professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University in DC. I have known his work since a long time ago, since the late 1990s, but today is really the first time for me to meet him, so I'm really excited. He graduated from Nanjing University and received his Ph.D. in history from Harvard University in 1996. Professor Yan has research interest in the following three areas: the technological construction of the Japanese empire in Asia, and in this area of his research interest, he published in 2011, Technology of Empire, Telecommunication and Japanese Expansion from 1883 to 1945 from Harvard University Press. And the second area of his research interest is the history and memory of World War II. And the third one is Japan's relationship with the rest of Asia, particularly China and Korea, in the post-war period. Now, whenever we meaning the members of the Center for Japanese Studies here at UCLA, invite a speaker, we give the speaker the total freedom to choose a topic to speak. But this time, I think I intervened in that process, whether he liked it or not, and if he did not, I'm really sorry for that. And that is mainly because Professor Yang is not simply a scholar in Ivory Tower, but in 2004 he was appointed as a consultant to the Nazi War Crimes and Japanese Imperial Government Records Interagency Working Group at the United States National Archives. He's also the founding co-director of the Memory and Reconciliation in the Asia-Pacific program based in the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at George Washington University. And in these capacities, he co-edited and authored several chapters in the following books: Rethinking Historical Injustice and Reconciliation in Northeast Asia. This was published in 2006 from Routledge. And most recent is Toward a History Beyond Borders, published in 2012 from Harvard University Press, which is, however, the English version of the Japanese and Chinese language versions. And I read the Japanese version a long time ago. I think I remember around 2005 or 2006. And today he's going to speak to us with this title, That Noble Dream, ? Reflections on History, Dialogue, and Reconciliation in East Asia. Now, reflection is a term that we use standing in the present, but looking back into the past. But this is really ongoing process, and not only our generation, but also the future generations has to deal with this reconciliation business in East Asia. So I'm really looking forward to what he's going to say today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Daqing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Mariko, for your kind introduction, and thank you all for coming on such a beautiful Friday afternoon. When we speak of East Asia in terms of international relations, there seem to be a lot of bad news. Well, this morning there was one piece of good news, but only good in the sense of the bad news. That is, the leaders of China and Japan finally agreed to meet after 2.5 years. This is considered good news. At the same time, Korean and Japanese leaders have not met for all this time. And there are other rising tensions, military and other areas, and a lot of had to do with what we call the history problem, one of which, in fact, even impact the United States. I'm thinking of the so-called military comfort woman issue, when Korean American communities set up monuments, one of which is near LA. It has raised a lot of controversies in Japan and even here. And on top of that, we have territorial disputes, which have also a very significant historical component. Many of us seem to be resigned to this phenomenon of rising nationalism. What is often left out the radar screen is what I call a surge of cross-national dialogues over difficult history that happened in the first decade of this century. Of course, people can say that these dialogues did happen, but they made no effect, because after all, we are in a very difficult period. But we can rethink this question maybe together. So what I wanted to do is to give a kind of a factual report, what has happened in terms of these dialogues, but also to give a more reflective thinking in terms of what they meant and what issues they raise, not just for East Asia, but also for historians in general. And that's why I borrowed the title from a book published in 1988 by American historian teaching at University of Chicago, Peter Novick. That book is called That Noble Dream, The Objectivity Question and the American Historical Profession. So what is this noble dream then? In some ways, I think this quote from a different historian, in this case a British historian around the turn of the last century, sort of summarizes this dream of universal truth. Now Waterloo here apparently referred to the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon was defeated decisively. So our Waterloo must be one that satisfies French and German and English and Dutch alike, that nobody can tell without examining the list of authors where Bishop Oxford laid down the pen and where Fairbairn or Gasquet, Lieberman or Harrison took it up. So what was this about? Lord Acton was the editor-in-chief of the Cambridge History of Modern World. So he sent this note to every contributor and essentially asking them to write in such a fashion that will pass as universal truth without national bias. Now, as Peter Novick pointed out in his book, in the ensuing decades, this dream of this universal truth of absolute objectivity has been shattered. There's saying that every man his historian, or every group its own historian, in the sense that writing history is being so tied up with identity, and also this idea of a determined relationship between facts and interpretation is very much problematic, as Hayden White and others remind us. So the question I pose here is, as I said earlier, what cross-national dialogues over history have been carried out in East Asia, and what were the genesis and impact of these dialogues? And then what should be the objective of history dialogues, and is shared or common history precondition to historical reconciliation in general? Now, before I talk about the history dialogues, I want to give a little background and bringing this reconciliation into my discussion. Reconciliation is a term that increasingly is used to refer to the process of overcoming animosities generated by conflict or abuse of human rights in domestic context. So, in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was one of those kind of prototype. Then in post-war Germany and France, we speak of a rather successful example of reconciling over centuries of conflict. But in Cold War East Asia, I would argue we had experienced something I would call thin reconciliation. And this is a term perhaps anthropologists can relate to, thick versus thin description in terms of Clifford Geertz's work. But this term, thin reconciliation, actually is coined by a philosopher, David Croker, who teaches at University of Maryland, that talk about, I kind of redefined the term somewhat to address the post-war history. Namely, you have a limited reconciliation at the state level, but not much involving the society or dealing with the interpretation of history itself. And that's kind of a working definition I propose. And this is in the context of the Cold War. I point out at least three major characteristics. One is the deep ideological division, in this case between revolution, communism on the one hand, and capitalism on the other. And I put nationalism on the opposite side of revolution and communism because communism, revolution, and to some extent capitalism are transnational or supranational ideologies. To give you one example, we speak earlier about the rape of Nanjing. In the early 60s, this Chinese former justice who served at the Tokyo War Crimes trial, his name is Mei Ruao, he published an essay reminiscing about his role in the Tokyo War Crimes trial that convicted the commander of the Japanese troops in Nanjing, General Matsui, and condemned him to death. And this former judge, called for more studies of Nanjing massacre. And in China, however, the authorities criticized him for stirring up ethnic hatred, because Chinese leadership was seeing the common friendship between the Japanese people and the Chinese people as their objective. And of course, this division applied within East Asia, but also within countries like Korea and China, and to some extent in Japan as well. The second important factor of this thin reconciliation is the geopolitical priorities over past grievances. I give here two examples that may not be very familiar to audience here. Namely, 1956, the Republic of China, that is Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader, personally ordered his parliamentarians on a visit to Japan to pay tribute to Yasukuni Shrine. And obviously, this is the time before the so-called Class A war criminals were enshrined, but still, the Taiwanese embassy in Tokyo was opposed to Chinese politicians paying tribute to those Japanese military who had invaded China. But that was overruled by Chiang Kai-shek, because this is the time when Taiwan, or Republic of China, was competing for the goodwill of the Japanese people. And this is exactly what Chiang Kai-shek said. And then a few years later, the Japanese government awarded a medal to American General Curtis LeMay. Now, Curtis LeMay was the architect of the firebombing of Japanese cities that killed hundreds of thousands. Now, how could this happen in 1961? Now, obviously, he was not rewarded for what he did in World War II, but rather for his contribution to rebuilding Japanese air self-defense force. So what he did in the World War II era was then essentially brushed aside. Thirdly, especially with two Chinas and Korea, you have strong leaders and weak society. Whether you're looking at the 1965 Republic of China, Korea-Japan normalization under the dictator Park Chung-hee, or the 1972 PRC Japan normalization under Mao and Zhou. Essentially, the popular sentiment were not taken into consideration at the moment of normalization, which I think embodies the Thin reconciliation. Now, after the Cold War was winding down, we begin to have what some people call the Asia paradox. That is, antagonism despite interdependence among these Northeast Asian countries. Regional interaction interdependence increased since the early 1980s, with China opening up and adopting a market reform, and democratization taking place in Republic of Korea in the late 1980s and early 90s. Japan has a slightly different storyline, that is the post-bubble, but increasingly dependent on the China market. And social interactions, tourists, study abroad, also increased greatly among these three nations. But almost following the same timeline, you have increasing historical controversies. First, over history textbook in the 1980s, the first visit by Japanese Prime Minister Nakasone to Yasukuni Shrine. In 1990s, the Korean comfort women stepped forward. Compensation lawsuits by forced laborers. In the year 2000, a somewhat new phenomenon taking place in the form of the so-called Fusosha textbook, which is in some ways a backlash against the greater coverage of Japanese wartime aggression and atrocities in Japanese textbooks in the 1980s. And issues of Yasukuni resurfaced, with Koizumi insisting on visiting every year. And then added to all the history issues were the territorial disputes. So that's the kind of context to understand how historical history dialogue began in Northeast Asia. But I'm not here to suggest that this is the first time. In fact, if you look at the wider world, after World War I, there were already calls for dialogue over history by French and German educators. But interestingly, some Japanese educators at this time were also voicing support. I think they were mainly concerned with a kind of racist, racial discrimination against Japanese and Asians. After World War II, history dialogue restarted again in Europe, and then most famously between Germany, West Germany, and Poland in the late 1960s. And with East Asia, however, in the 60s, there was attempt to jumpstart history dialogue under the aegis of UNESCO, but it did not move forward. So the new start really was in the 1990s. And interestingly enough, Europe seemed to have made some contribution facilitating. In one concrete example, a Korean scholar who was visiting a German university came hold of a work published in Japan about German-Polish dialogue. And he was very much impressed with what he read, and upon returning to Japan, he initiated a kind of a academic dialogue about textbooks between Korean and Japanese scholars. So now I'm just going to give some overview of the several major genres of history dialogue. Now, of course, dialogue over history can take many, many forms. And in some ways, what we're doing here is a dialogue because we're going to have discussion afterwards. Academic conferences are history dialogue. Publishing papers for the general public or translating works into another language certainly are also dialogues over history. But here, I'm using the history dialogue in a more specific meaning to refer to those intentional, regular, sustained process of dialogue over history. Sustained in the sense that it's not a one-time event. Usually it's a multi-year or sometimes longer. So again, like I said, Japan, Korea were really the pioneers in history dialogue. And these are the non-government or semi-government. The 1995 is a critical time in Japan. We had the Prime Minister Murayama coming from the Socialist Party, ruling in coalition with the liberal wing of the LDP. And they were able to make a number of important measures, including the Asia Women's Fund. And they also started the Japan-Korea Joint History Research Forum. Now, this is a big umbrella kind of bilateral institution that brought teams of Korean and Japanese scholars together to address different areas, politics, but also history. So the first book here is co-edited by a Korean historian and a Japanese historian on the modern history of mutual exchange and mutual perception. The remaining three titles are examples of non-government Korea-Japan joint authorship of history books. And many of them were intended as teaching materials. For example, the first one were results of a multi-year exchange program between Tokyo Gakugei Daigaku and Seoul University of Teachers University. Seoul City University. And their subtitle, the main title is The History of Korea-Japan Exchange. The subtitle is A Shared or Common Teaching Material. The second one is an interesting joint history from the gender perspective. So it's mainly the work of women historian or activists. And the third is looking at modern history, but it also has a subtitle, Common History Teaching Material. So they started the beginning of this joint kind of history project had its genesis in the 1990s, but really got a kickstart in the early 2000s in response to the Fusosha textbook, which was eventually approved by the Japanese government as one of the many middle school textbooks to be adopted. So that gave them a kind of impetus. And the same applies to those books at the bottom. But before that, I just want to mention that in terms of multilateral dialogue, the two conferences, the first is the first conference, Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in the 1990s, mostly by, I think, Chinese American historians, but occasionally bringing Japanese participants and Chinese participants. The second one in the mid 2005, around that time, was started here in the United States by under the initiative of Professor Ezra Vogel of Harvard University to bring in international scholars from Europe, from North America, but also then China, Taiwan, and Japan to look at different aspects of the Second Sino-Japanese War. And this project is still continuing. They have published several conference volumes in English, in Japanese, and in Chinese. Military aspects of war, local society. They also have a website listing bibliography and others. But my main point of discussion here is this last one, is the first ever trilateral Korea-Japan joint history book. It went through two phases. The first began in 2001, the year when the Japanese Fusosha textbook or revisionist textbook was approved. And the participant in already existing dialogues decided, instead of simply critiquing or attacking this Fusosha textbook, they should come up with an alternative. And that was the birth of this particular project that eventually was published in 2005 in the Japanese under the title Mirao Hiraku Rekishi, a history that opens the future. The Chinese version is a more bland, modern history of 3 East Asian nations. But the significance is that it went through many discussions and they came up with a very kind of thin volume in 3 languages for the first time. And this book is essentially focused on the history of Japanese aggression. And that's understandable at that time, but it also became a reason for many criticism. So what is interesting is then this group, unlike the other groups of Korea-Japan joint authorship, this group continued incorporating some of the criticisms, and they produced a second installment. And this time it's 2 volumes, again under slightly different titles. And what you have here in your hand is my own very, very, very rough translation of their table of contents. And one of the ways they responded to the criticism is that it was too narrowly focused on Japanese aggression, and it's not really a history of modern East Asia. And secondly, it was focused on the state. So what they did is, in their first volume, they stick more or less to this chronological history of the changing international relations. But the most interesting, in my view, is their second volume, which is a thematically ranged history that paid attention to the people and the society and institutions. So you can see that they have a very wide range of subjects, ranging from urbanization to railway, migration, family, gender, school education, media, but of course not overlooking the war and the masses. Again, it's jointly authored. You can, unlike what Lord Acton had wanted his contributors to do, these books all list the name of authors who authored which chapter. I was fortunate enough to have attended one of their meetings in Seoul, and it's quite a remarkable endeavor. Number one, it was translated in all. Interpretation was not the simultaneous interpretation, which would be very costly, as you all know. So they just translated after each comment in all 3 languages. So it's extremely time-consuming. So what happened is they decide division of labor, and then the author will provide the draft for other historians to critique, and then on the basis of that, revise the draft and then get critiqued again. Now, this is being a very, very time-consuming process, and they also want to wrap this up against the deadline. So there are areas of disagreement, and as a result, the second volume, the last chapter, they couldn't agree on the text. So what happened is then they published the text by the original author, but in this case a Korean scholar, but then added the comments by the Japanese members and then by the Chinese members. So as a finished text, this probably is not ideal, but it's also interesting for people studying the process of dialogue. It's actually quite revealing. Now, I just want to then say something about the government-sponsored joint history research. I did some research when I was, at one point I was a research fellow at the Northeast Asia History Foundation in Korea that gave me opportunity to meet some of the members of the Korean-Japan joint history research. It again started before the Japan-China joint research, and it went through two phases. It began in the year 2001. It's actually quite interesting. The idea of a government-sponsored history dialogue named Joint History Research didn't come out suddenly. So in some ways, it was already based on the familiarity with European government-sponsored textbook dialogue between Germany and Poland, and also based on the Korea-Japan non-government dialogue. So interestingly, it was then President Kim Dae-jung. Oh, actually, excuse me. He was then the opposition leader in, I think, around 1995, who brought this idea to Doi Takako, who was then the head of the chairwoman of the Japanese lower house. But that was not immediately followed. But come to year 2001, as we know, Prime Minister of Japan visited Yasukuni Shrine, which started this kind of protest. And this time, Japan kind of revived the idea of a kind of joint history research. And the Korean side accepted. However, the Korean side wanted this joint research to have a immediate sort of direct impact on textbooks, because this is also the year when the Fusosha textbook was approved. Through negotiation, the Korean side eventually dropped the textbook demand, and the Japanese side dropped their demand to take up the territorial issue. So this compromise allowed the two governments to launch the joint history research. It was done by historians, and the selection of historians also later posed some problems. But by and large, it was concluded without major problems in 2006. And then another round started in 2007. And in the Korea-Japan joint history research, the topics were quite diverse. It covered all eras from ancient to modern times. And what is interesting and also very helpful for an observer like me is you can read the written critiques that was included in the publication. In the second phase, both sides agreed to have a textbook subcommittee. So you could see that the Korean side had made some progress. But when it concluded its study, however, there's no real recommendations for textbook writers. So the image down here is then Prime Minister Koizumi meeting with the delegates from Korea and Japan, and then you have the second round there. Now, China-Japan in some ways kind of modeled after Korea-Japan, but the starting date is 5 years later. Now, the starting of the Japan-China joint research also had its particular political context. In year 2000, there was massive demonstrations against Japan in China in major cities. And then Japanese Foreign Minister Machimura criticized China's anti-Japanese education for leading to this kind of massive protest by the youth. So almost on the defense, the Chinese kind of agreed to this idea of joint study of, with Japanese side. And it covers, like Korea, Japan, all eras. I should point out that for China, Japan, to include the pre-modern era is based on the notion that the entire 2,000-year history of Japan-China relations is good. But only the modern time is bad. So if you cover only the modern era, it will be very, very negative. So if you cover the longer span of history, then it helps put in perspective. And unlike the Korea-Japan one, the China-Japan team kind of sat down and agreed on the select topics, which are very, very general. And then each side essentially write their own kind of parallel history. Of course, there are discussions, many, many sessions. But unlike the Korea-Japan, not only was the discussion not disclosed, at the insistence of the Chinese government, the post-1945 section was not publicized. There are different explanations for this. Some suspect that it was the Tiananmen, how you describe 1989 event, upset the Chinese. But the Chinese scholars and some Japanese scholars argue it's actually the Tokyo war crimes trial, which set the two countries widely apart, and that was considered one of the reasons. So basically, it seems around year 2008, the Chinese side had a kind of change of heart or buyer's regret for having agreed to this joint historical research, because that would allow the Japanese sort of, let's say, more center or center conservative views to be aired in China side by side with the Chinese view. In fact, there was one Chinese scholar who published an article in China under a pseudonym that made this argument that he used a little bit more extreme language. Essentially, he was saying that the logic of the history on the side of the perpetrators is now presented as an academic viewpoint with the equal validity as the views of the victim side. So from the start, he kind of dismissed this as a problematic, and unfortunately, his pessimistic reading turned out to be somewhat true, at least look at the Chinese government. So finally, this is the project I personally had some involvement with, and this is what Professor Tamanoi mentioned. This is a non-government project funded by a Japanese foundation that started in early 2000s, bringing Japanese and Chinese scholars based overseas into a regular kind of dialogue. We essentially started with the most controversial issues in the modern Sino-Japanese relations. And then we tried to present as broad, as balanced views as we can, also including the key texts, historical documents, thus enabling the reader to make some judgment on their own. So this came out in year 2005, 2006, in both Chinese and Japanese. Then eventually it came out in the English translation toward a history beyond borders that looked at these contentious issues in modern Chinese-Japanese history, modern being the late 19th century to the post-war period. Now this project went on to publish 2 more books, but essentially they're similar to kind of a conference volume, so to speak, in the sense that these subjects are all very diverse. The level of the joint discussion was not that great. So currently, in the last 2-3 years, we've shifted gear, and we are now hosting an annual summer seminar for young historians from Japan, from China, but also a few from Taiwan. Young historian, in this case, refer to Ph.D. students or recent Ph.D.s who specialize in their own country's history. In other words, Japanese participants are mostly studying Japanese history in Japan. Chinese participants are studying Chinese history. Now, why is this? The rationale is that these 2 groups have fewer opportunities to interact. Whereas if you study, say, Chinese history in Japan or Japanese history in China, they interact much more frequently. And then secondly, this is also the reality in Japan and China, namely, if you study your own country's history in the sort of academic hierarchy, you are more likely to occupy the center, positions of influence. Whereas if you study foreign history, then your relative influence is less. So the rationale here is then we would like to socialize potential opinion makers, influential historians at an early stage. And so far, as far as these seminar goes, they're quite good. And we just have to see in terms of the mid to long-term prospect. Now, having given you some, this kind of factual background, I want to move to some of the issues raised by these history dialogues. Now, there are problems with the scope and themes, especially with the earlier joint histories and the joint history research. For example, the Japan-China Joint History Research sponsored the government, the most focused on the traditional international diplomatic military history. There's very, very little discussion of people's sort of society, partly because they're dominated by these political historians. That's the problem with the first trilateral history, but to some extent addressed by the second installment. Women's history, yes, we have that volume between Korea and Japan, but in terms of this government-sponsored research, there are hardly any women on both teams. Now, did they produce any convergence or even consensus? In the Japan-China official sponsored history dialogue, indeed, there were some areas of convergence. One example is the term "shinryaku," aggression, was used to describe by both Korean, Japanese, and Chinese historians to describe the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese invasion of China. Now, this may be significant, but there also invited criticism from some Chinese quarters, namely, why do we have to spend 5 years just to come to this conclusion? We already know that. But in its defense, I think it has some significance because the Japanese team of the historians are these more mainstream or orthodox, influential historians. The fact that they agreed to this term is not without significance. Now, obviously, whether politicians actually listen to such recommendations or conclusions is another matter. In fact, Prime Minister Abe did not. I think he made a comment a year or two ago in public saying, the term aggression is something to be studied by historians in the future. Well, not future, it's already here. But the problem of this is there are also criticism that, this is a political sort of compromise, or compromise made for political convenience. I think in fairness, it is hard to reach, any conclusion in such a national sort of setting, or cross-national setting in some ways, especially if it's government-sponsored. So I personally feel, some credit has to be given to the limited consensus here. There's also a question about the academic quality. Now, this is sometimes voiced by the more established historians when they look at these non-government projects. Why? Because often these non-government projects were, say, involving high school teachers, sometimes NGO activists. So it's not academic enough in the eyes of these academic historians. But to some extent, there's even, I think, it's a variety of qualities, and that is something I think the historians, participants are aware of. Representativeness is also an issue. For example, the joint authored history books for Korea, Japan, these are historians not at the center or in influential institutions. So they're kind of historians or educators from the sideline to some extent. With China, it's different. The Chinese Social Science Academy, Beijing University, both very influential academic institutions, have very sort of high representation in both these government and non-government representativeness. And this brings also to the problem of impact. It's one thing to publish a book, and even in both countries, but if no school actually use them, then immediately invites the criticism that, okay, it doesn't live up to its expectations. As far as I know, with the trilateral history book, it's not used in schools, with the exception of some elective courses in very, very select schools. For example, my alma mater in Nanjing, they sometimes teach a course on peace studies, and the teacher had participated in some history dialogue in Korea, and he had used that first edition or first volume in some of his classes. At the university level, for example, in Japan and Korea, some of the publications have been used. But then this picture you have is the sort of housewives in Japan sometimes get together for these study meetings, sessions, and then they actually use the Japanese edition to learn more about what other Asian neighbors are looking at the history. Government interference definitely was a problem, especially with the Japan-China one, but to a lesser problem with the Japan-Korea one. Now, interference comes with different forms. In the case of the Japan-China one, the government of China definitely made a very direct intervention. They didn't want anything to be published initially. It is through this difficult negotiation that they finally agreed to allow the publication minus the post-1945. With other Japan-Korea selection, the interference is a less obvious form. For instance, the selecting of members, according to Professor Kitaoka, who was one of the prime movers behind the Japanese teams, he had said openly that he wanted to choose scholars with reputable publication and reputation, but also these scholars understand our position. So partly because these official, even to some extent unofficial dialogues are built on sort of national basis, especially with the government one, you almost have the scenario, you have two national teams competing each other. and they're pushed into becoming spokespersons, either directly or indirectly being aware that this is the government-funded project, and there are government representatives sitting at the discussion. So in that sense, the presence of government can work against a free discussion. So, on the other hand, arguing over history is not necessarily a bad thing. There are scholars of international relations who actually developed the theories of sort of communicative action in international relations. There's a famous article called "Let's Argue," which is based on the sort of this idea that through argument you can develop a certain kind of argumentative rationality, and as a way of overcoming the conflict. So in some ways, there is this aspect to the start of the joint government-sponsored dialogue is to serve as a diplomatic tool to kind of remove this very contentious emotional history issue from the front burner to the back burner, so that politicians can deal with other issues where they can make cooperation. And this is the argument, again, of Professor Kitaoka. In, say, year 2001, you have issues of, Fusosha textbook, Yasukuni visit. History is at the forefront. But by agreeing to start joint history research, which is a multi-year project, you at least allow historians to sort things out, right? Freeing the politicians to do something else. So in some ways, this can work in favor of, reconciliation in a limited sense. But more importantly, as many participants admit, this sustained arguing and discussion allow them to understand the other side better. By this, I mean not simply, what Koreans think about Japan or Japan think about Korea, but also why they think this way. And even as the head of the Chinese team, Professor Bu Ping, later published in China, he started calling for the respect of difference, which is, within this context of heated historical debate, is a very significant step. In other words, I may disagree with you, your interpretation of history, but at least we can sit down and talk. Now, political leaders have not quite learned how to do this, right? Self-critical stance is also a positive outcome of some of these dialogues. In other words, having your own history being scrutinized by historians from neighboring countries made you aware that your own standard interpretation may not always hold. But what are these dialogues eventually going to deliver? This is a term which I have to look up in the dictionary, but it's proposed by a historian, Charlie Mayer, who has studied the historians' debate in Germany and in Europe. And his suggestion is not so much about history dialogue, but how to deal with contentious history with multiple voices. And I think this may be offering something that we can think about. Namely, I quote from him that historians can validly write contrapunctal history, which parallel storylines that are read horizontally but maintain some determinate relation with each other. In other words, you can still allow different voices, but they have to have a definite relation with each other. So, I continue to quote, the independence of voices must be maintained even within a multivocal structure. And he went on to say that any rush to reach synthesis is suspect. So I think he may be offering a cautionary tale that if we aim at producing a kind of common history too fast, this indeed has a problem of sort of silencing the multiple voices, which should be part of a history of conflict. But then again, he also argues that there should have terminate relationship with each other, so they produce this kind of contrapunto, which is a musical concept that I understand. And another aim that I think many of the practitioners of history dialogue in East Asia are aiming is the transnational epistemic community. In other words, instead of rushing to produce something that can then be held up as a product, is to build this community. So this joint Japan-China young historians dialogue is one effort. And at the same time, there's another one. It's a trilateral Korea, Japan, China young kind of historians seminar, which happens every year, and they take place in Korea, China, and Japan. So this seems to be a kind of new trend in East Asia. So final thoughts. I just want to mention that the history dialogue is increasingly a global concern. At Columbia University, they have created something called an Alliance of History Dialogue Accountability, which bring together really a global network of practitioners who deal with either domestic or interstate conflict, whether it's in Latin America or in the Balkans. So this issue of history dialogue as part of the process of reconciliation is very much widely recognized. So still, the question of the form and the objective, there are some issues. For example, I think many historians, if you ask them, is it necessary to have history dialogue? They would say, well, history is always an open dialogue. We don't need this intervention by the government or by historian community. We should just let it grow as an organic form in a free marketplace of ideas. So I think intervention or organic, there is still some tension here, especially after some of this joint government-sponsored project have not really borne fruit as had been expected. Then the question of government. Here the view is divided. Something once the government involved, it automatically ruins things. The problem then is if no government is involved, then the path towards a curriculum reform is very much blocked. So when Democratic Party of Japan was still in power, then Foreign Minister Okada Katsuya had indicated that the joint textbook as a future objective, but requiring many years of dialogue. And another question is the outsiders. By outsiders, I put in quotation mark, meaning, for example, people from North America and even Europe, because Europe has actually played quite a big role in the East Asia dialogue. As you know, in Germany, there is a Gerd Eckert Institute for International Textbooks Research that has been quite active in East Asia. They're translating books. Their books, for example, sponsoring scholars from Korea or Japan, or they're translating books from European languages into Korean and Japanese. Common textbook between French and German are being translated with the help of European scholars. North Americans, whether they're outsiders, is a question because in many ways, if we talk about reconciliation, North America, United States, and East Asia are not easily separated, especially if we think about World War II Hiroshima, Nagasaki, air raid. But here I would say that academic institutions and individuals in North America definitely have a role, but not to the extent to take the center in these East Asian dialogues. Because there's a tendency that once we switch to English or, then the East Asian scholars tend to be sidelined. And that's why I think several of these East Asian history dialogue specifically insist on using East Asian languages, even though they have to do 3 times translation. I have to say the Korean are very good at doing this kind of translation work, interesting enough. So some question remains, but I would welcome any thoughts you have, any criticism you may have. But thank you very much for your attention.